welcome to Is This Lit? I'm Casey, and have I got a tale for you. An early release for the PS4 and also available for Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and Xbox One, you might have overlooked Murdered Soul Suspect. This action-adventure stealth game, developed by Airtight Games in 2014, follows the story of protagonist Detective Ronan O'Connor as he sleuths around a fictionalized version of Salem, Massachusetts, hunting down the Bell Killer and learning the truth behind his untimely death. Oh yeah, forgot to mention, he's dead the whole time. What a twist! Now, the game received an average reception upon release. To be fair, this game is very short. Like, very short. You can do a non-completionist run of the entire thing in about 7 hours. Also, it's a detective story, a murder mystery, which, as you might imagine, once you know whodunit, doesn't really have that much replay value. However, the game has been praised for its story aspects and original concept, and that's what I'm here for. I'll level with you. Initially, when I sat down to create this episode, I was going to tackle the literary device of foreshadowing, and how this device is implemented well throughout the story. But then I had another idea. Why don't we break into some comparative literature and discuss the historical elephant in the room, namely Abigail Williams, who, spoiler alert, was a very real and very historically relevant character. Abigail Williams features as the manipulative, diabolical main antagonist of Soul Suspect, as well as the manipulative and diabolical antagonist of another rather famous literary work. Chances are, if you, like me, attended a public high school, then you might already be familiar with it, the Crucible. Penned by American playwright Arthur Miller in 1953, The Crucible is a dramatized and partially fictionalized account of the Salem witch trials, and an allegory for McCarthyism. What really interested me were the two drastically different characterizations of Abigail Williams presented to us, and most intriguingly, which characterization was actually most accurate to the real historical Abigail Williams. So let's dive in. First, let's paint a picture of the girl, the myth, the legend, Abigail Williams. She was born on July 12, 1680, and resided in Salem, Massachusetts. She lived with her uncle, Reverend Samuel Parris, and his young daughter, her cousin, Elizabeth, or Betty, Parris. This living situation was because Abigail was an orphan, having lost her parents in a Native American raid. Abigail and Betty were the first two accusers in the infamous Salem witch trials of 1692 and 1693. She was 12 years old at the time. Abigail and Betty quite suddenly began having fits of screaming, contorting, and rolling around, claiming that spirits were pinching and harming them. Reverend Parris called in a doctor to determine whether or not these afflictions were medical or spiritual in nature. Dr. William Griggs was baffled and determined that it must be witchcraft. Parris's slave Tituba was told to bake something called a witch's cake, which apparently consists of rye mixed with the urine of the afflicted. Yeah, I'm so glad I know that now. Anyways, they feed this thing to a dog, and if the dog then experiences weird symptoms, then it's clearly 1,000% witchcraft. I guess the dog acted bewitched, because a few days after this witch cake incident, Abigail, Benny, and several other afflicted local girls began shouting out names, accusing members of their community of being witches in league with the devil. Abigail Williams leads the charge and accuses a total of 57 people of witchcraft. Interestingly, though, she only took part in 8 of these trials. All trace of her in historical records vanishes about halfway through the Salem witch trials, and there is no solid record or evidence explaining what became of her. Of her victims, 15 were executed, 1 was tortured to death, and the others either died in jail, were pardoned, found not guilty, or escaped. Abigail Williams gives her last testimony on June 3, 1692. She never apologized for her role in the trials. In fact, Ann Putnam Jr. was the only afflicted girl who ever did. The location of her grave is unknown. Now, let's look at the Abigail we see in the game. Firstly, Soul Suspect portrays Abigail Williams as a young girl, roughly age 11 or 12. Okay, that lines up. Her flashbacks show that she did indeed act as an accuser during the Salem witch trials, and harbors a deep hatred of witches. But that's where things take a very fictionalized turn. Remember how the real Abigail Williams lived with her uncle because she lost her parents in a brutal raid? Well, scratch all that. In the game's version of things, Abigail has a cruel and mentally and physically abusive father, who forces her to accuse his political enemies, even going so far as to torture her into compliance. As a result, she becomes obsessed with persecuting those she believes to be witches, both in life and death. In this version of events, Abigail's fate is clear. When the local government finally extinguishes the witch trials, they conclude that even under pressure and torturing, this poor kid, Abigail will never give up her persecution, and are afraid of what the young girl might be capable of if she were allowed to go free. They sentence her to death by hanging, and just before her execution, Abigail draws the symbol of a bell on the floor of her cell, and vows to purge the town of witches, even if it takes her an eternity to do it. Now, On to Abigail in The Crucible. This portrayal loses points right off the bat because Abigail is portrayed as a beautiful 17-year-old. It does score points, however, for sticking to the real Abigail's backstory and having her reside with her uncle due to being orphaned in a raid. The story states that she and Betty had been dancing in the woods and performing voodoo rituals with the other local girls in Tituba. When rumors begin to circulate about the presence of witchcraft in the sleepy little town, Abigail and Betty start to name people as witches in order to divert suspicion and save their own skin. In the play, womanly Abigail Williams has been employed as a maid in the Proctor household before being kicked out for having an affair with John Proctor. Yeah, again, just pointing out that historically Abigail was 12 during this time, and accounts show Mr. Proctor to be about 60. This older Abigail is more calculating and vengeful, accusing others initially in an attempt to avoid severe punishment for casting spells, adultery, and plotting the murder of John Proctor's wife, Elizabeth, all in the name of having John Proctor to herself. In this version of her story, the town eventually turns on Abigail and her pack of hysterical girls, and she flees one night on a boat bound for Barbados after stealing her uncle's savings. In an epilogue of the play entitled Echoes Down the Corridor, Miller states that according to legend, Abigail sailed to Boston, where she becomes a prostitute. This has never been proven nor disproven. So, who hit the nail more on the head? First of all, 1 point to murdered soul suspect for actually getting the girl's age right. Now, on to backstory. This category I give to The Crucible. Arthur Miller's Abigail Williams is an orphan, living with her uncle and cousin Betty, after losing her parents in a brutal fashion. Abigail's backstory in this regard, in Sole Suspect, is completely fictionalized. Next up, we have overall motivations. Now, I actually surprised myself and had to give this one to The Crucible as well. Going into this, I had really expected to give the crown to Murdered Soul Suspect, mostly due to the crazy liberties taken with Abigail's age and romantic relationship with John Proctor. I thought, no way could this be closer. But, let's face it, Abigail's motivations in Sole Suspect come from a completely fictionalized place, her father's torture and manipulation. It removes her initial agency and oddly makes her more sympathetic as a traumatized victim. She develops an obsession with hunting down and killing witches as a direct result of the torture she experienced. In The Crucible, while yes, a large portion of her motivation, namely her desire for John Proctor, is mere fabrication, she has the agency. It is her decision to accuse and defame. She does all of the horrific things that she does throughout the trials because she wanted to, and this holds true to the historical accounts of Abigail Williams. Neither the game nor the play gets any points for the depiction of Abigail's fate, as it's completely up to speculation what actually happened to her. However, I have to say that I find how Sole Suspect filled in the blank the most satisfying. Justice comes to the false accuser, and Abigail is hanged just like her innocent victims. So yeah, The Crucible wins out over Murdered Soul Suspect for historical accuracy. But honestly, both tales are enjoyable. While yes, it is short, Murdered Soul Suspect has a strong and inventive narrative that does keep you captivated throughout. A detective story, a period piece, this game really is entertaining. So if you ever have about 7 hours on your hands, I highly recommend checking it out. Is Murdered Soul Suspect lit? Well, it's just as lit as Arthur Miller's The Crucible. So enjoy. It's been lit, fam!